So the next adjustment layer that we're going to be looking at is ways to convert things into black and white, because there's lots of times that we might want to also just do a black and white image, and there's several ways to do it, but we're going to look at two to kind of compare what their benefits are as we look at our images. So let's take a quick look. I'm just going to go ahead and pull open an image from our location scouting days. All right, so let's use this image, only because it's got a little bit of like reds, orange, so it's got some green, it's got some blue, got some yellow. So we've got some different colors we can kind of work with. I think so that range is probably bigger than a lot of the other pictures. So we'll use that image. So there's really two ways, well, there's lots of ways to do black and white, but we're gonna look at two. The easiest way is to go in here and go to our adjustment layers. And we can just go up here and we can go to hue and saturation. And double check and make sure that you're on master, not on cyan or blue or something else, because we were doing adjustments earlier. And if we just take saturation, if I go in one direction, it makes the color super crazy, yuck. Or if I take it the other direction all the way out, it creates a black and white image, right? Done. Couldn't be easier. The only thing is it may not be the best black and white that I could possibly create. So that is a way of doing it though. So we'll leave that there, and we're going to look at a second way. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this adjustment layer again and choose instead black and white. And now I can't do it with this hue and saturation on, so I'm going to turn that off, right? So once we get in there, it gives us a bunch of different sliders, right? Red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, right? Those are all of the colors and their complements or their opposites, right? Or the ones that are joined together, right? So red and green make yellow, blue and green make cyan, and red and blue make magenta, right? So those are all kind of the colors that we learned from the color wheels, in the week number 2. But the thing that's great about being able to do this one is that it can allow us to work with the color that's there, right? It's different than just shooting black and white film, because then that's all you have, right? Or changing your camera to black and white. There's really no reason to ever do that, because the software will work a lot better if it knows what the underlying colors are. So let's take a look at what those channels will actually be doing, right? So let's turn off this for a second and look at our colors, right? So there is some red. So let's start with red since it's the first one. So what I can do now is I can go in here and I can take the red channel and I can either make it darker or lighter, right? Now notice it did the reds back in the background, also did my face, right? Because there's red in my face. So, I'm going to have to find a happy medium where I think it's going to be good, but I don't want that red to disappear into that background. I'd like there to be some contrast between it. So I might go in and do something like maybe around there so that that red has some pop or some separation. But we can also look, I don't want the skin tone to become too kind of flattened out, right? So another color, this one over here, this is yellow. Right now, yellow will also probably be in the skin tone as well, but this is way too hot, right? So let's see if we take this yellow and we drag it. This way is making it brighter. This way is making it darker. So again, I might be able to pull a little bit of detail out of that yellow, but it doesn't look like it's going to want to come out of there. So we may have to bring that one down separately on its own channel. So I'm going to ignore that square back there, and I'm just going to look at skin tone and affect the contrast overall. So another one we've got is green. So we know there's definitely some green in this wall and probably one of these blocks back here. So let's see what happens when we do green. So again, I can make, and look, that green, that yellow also had a lot of green in it. So luckily we were able to salvage some detail out of that one there with breaking down that green. Cyan, so we can start to affect the cyans, which are going to be kind of those bluer colors. If I want to go darker, right, I can make that whole background darker if I wanted to. And again, it's just looking at what is that color, and then how can we push or pull that. Blue, I can go up, make those either brighter or darker, right? Huge difference in the way that those values are going to be represented. Like maybe it really opens up the flannel, the flannel goes darker there. And then the last one being magenta. And I don't think there's a lot of magenta in that picture originally, so it's affecting our red a little bit. So if I did want that red a little bit darker, I can bring it down some, and it's not really affecting the skin tone this time, so it does finally give us a little more pop out of there. Let's play with these just one more time, just to get the overall effect that we want. All right, so now that we've played around with those colors a little bit, I wanted there to be a little more contrast and a little more separation, and I wanted a little bit more in the skin tones to have a little more contrast as well. And so let's compare that to our the one that the hue and saturation did on its own. So we'll go ahead and turn that off. So there's our original color. There's the hue saturation. Again, it's a little bit flatter, doesn't have as much definition as opposed to, you know, in this case where we really pulled out. And again, looking at what those colors were and really kind of adjusting them and, you know, being able to manipulate those in a way that's going to push and pull those contrasts. And that's really different than like if I decided I wanted to have something that felt more like that and I just did the hue saturation. You know, I could go in and do something like brightness and contrast, but you know, the contrast when it does it, it's going to make the whites whiter and the darks darker. You know, it may never necessarily like shift some of these colors into being darker, right? It's because it's not looking at that overall value, right? It can increase contrast, but it's not going to be able to adjust individual colors based on, you know, those changes. So I wouldn't be able to kind of push and manipulate those values in the same way. And it really depends on, you know, what's in your photo, right? So, you know, that was much flatter. And then again, you know, there we were able to manipulate those colors and push and pull them to create kind of more high contrast look, but still maintain the right exposure inside of the face, right? So that's kind of how we can manipulate those. And if we keep that in mind too, these are also just, you know, they're just adjustment layers, right? So they also come along with a layer mask. So I might decide that I want, you know, maybe let's say we wanted skin tone to be visible, right? I could still come in and do that, right? I could take, I'll just bring it for 100% for right now. But if I wanted to hide the change that's on this layer here, I could make sure that I'm on the layer mask, and I could conceal it by hitting with black. So I'm going to hit X, and I've still got my brush tool. And so I could come in here and I could just paint myself, you know, to have color. Now this is where it might really come in handy to make sure that you're using a selection, right? So it might be a good idea to make a good lasso tool selection and then come in and do something like that. But if I wanted to quickly kind of clean it up, I could come along here and just make sure that I take any color out of these little areas and, you know, off of the top over here and so on. And it'll give us the overall feeling of that. And if I needed to, I could always zoom in, Command plus plus plus, and then I can hit X on the keyboard, and I can make my brush smaller, and I could, you know, make sure that I keep some color in this area and not in this area. And again, I've got a pretty soft brush, so, you know, and then X, and I can make this brush smaller again. But you can see this is why having a selection would be a much better way of doing it, right? So you're not constantly going back and forth and painting. I know sometimes it feels like, oh, making a selection is so hard, but you know, there we go. So if we pull back out, you know, that's something we could do with it. We don't have to do something like that. You know, we could also make the whole thing white or, you know, black. And maybe I just want one of those squares for a pop of color, so I could come in and maybe I could, now if I wanted to do something like that, I might want to use the polygonal lasso tool. But you know, notice these are blurry, right? They're not 100% sharp. So I might want to change my pixel here, let's say like 5. I don't know how blurry those are. And then as I go in here, I can start to make my selection around this polygon over here. And then now that I've got that selection, anything that I paint with black is going to only go inside there, right? So again, I can hit B on the keyboard to bring up the brush tool, or I can click on the brush, and then I could then paint this in. And because I have a selection, I can be, you know, sloppy. Doesn't really matter because it's not going to go outside of where I made my selection. If I want to make sure that I'm getting everything, I can make it bigger and so on, right? So I can go right up against those edges. So I could go in and, you know, pull out a couple of colors and allow those to show up or whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. It's really up to you how you want to go about manipulating those, but the end result is that you can combine those black and whites and colors, or you can just manipulate the black and white if we just want to have a really nice black and white image. You know, ways to kind of play with it. one last thing since we're talking about black and white. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Option or Command Delete so that I don't, and let's deselect and just, oops. And let's go ahead and fill that with white. That way we're still in black and white. Another thing that we could do, oops. Another thing that we could do with our black and white image is we might want to give it like a color cast, right? Sometimes we want it to have more of a vintage feel or old-timey feel, something like that. There's lots of ways we could do that. So we can come in here with our adjustment layers, and let's try one that just says color fill. So now it filled it with red, which I'm not a fan of red. But let's pick something that's kind of like more of like a hue that's kind of like a, more of like think of like a sepia toned color. And I can always pull this up or down. Let's go to image green. Let's just try that. Okay. Now, when we do that, right, it's filling the whole thing with color. But we've got these cool things over here, which are our adjustment layer, or our blending modes, right? So we're on normal. We can try just color. And then that then applies that color over top of the entire image. Now, once we have that, we can still go in and fuss with the color, right? So I might go, well, that yellow is maybe a little bit too strong. What about something, if I bring it up or, maybe you don't have quite so much saturation in it and try something more like that. And we can keep kind of adjusting. If I decided I wanted to make a cyanotype, I could go and make a cyanotype instead, right? It's just overlaying that color over top of those black and white values. And so I can play with all sorts of different hues or colors as kind of that overlay. So let's say I liked that a little bit better. I also have the ability to bring down the opacity, so I could say, oh, maybe it's not quite so much, I'll just do a little bit of it. And again, we can see what that effect is, right? So, now that I look at it, that seems a little bit cool, right? It's kind of, yes, it's got that black and white, and this just gives a little bit of warmth to it. If I turned off the black and white, it would also put some of that color over top of it too. So it's another way to kind of create like a vintage color feeling, is to have a color fill color over top of it and then allow that opacity, to do color only. And then that way it affects it in a slightly different way, right? So there's lots of ways we can play with these adjustment layers. And the idea is that, all of this is non-destructive, right? I still have my original down here. It's not affecting anything. I can make as many different types of changes in this area, that area. It's just adding a little bit of space to the actual file, but it's not ever affecting my underlying image, which is why we want to do things in a non-destructive way. So I'm excited to see what you guys are going to do with your senior portraits. You're going to be doing lots of editing over the next few days, working with those pictures, and give yourself a variety. Try different things, do one this way and one that way, and, and just kind of experiment with what it is that you can do to create some images that really express kind of what you were thinking about, or maybe tell more of a story about that person, or highlight that time of day that you shot, and those sort of things. So get in there. If you have questions, by all means, reach out. I'd be happy to help.